Major funding for American Makeover provided by Notre Dame School of Architecture, making places durable, beautiful, and sustainable. Additional support provided by Placemakers. Cultivating place at placemakers.com. And from viewers like you. Thank you.
We went through a very strange time in America over the course of basically the 50 to 60 years post-World War II, when everything we knew about how to build a community was more or less thrown out the window. It's an era that I grew up in. I grew up in the sprawl that resulted from it. And the folks behind Seaside were some of the people who really finally said it loudly and said, this is going wrong. We need to do something differently. Seaside is an 80-acre resort community located on the Gulf of Mexico in northwest Florida. It was founded in 1981 by Robert and Daryl Davis, Andrés Duany, and Elizabeth Plater Zyberk. Robert and Daryl and Andreas and Liz said, we're going to create an actual town. And that was where they really went just a completely different direction and a new way that really shook the earth a bit and has spawned community after community, in fact an entire movement called the New Urbanism, which is a movement to move away from sprawl and towards mixed-use walkable communities.
Well, you know, it's the summer of 2010, and it's almost exactly 30 years ago that we were designing Seaside right here on this piece of ground. This land had been logged and possibly burnt. There was a kind of bramble about 3 feet high everywhere, exceedingly ugly. And we had been retained by Robert Davis, a developer who at the time was about 35 years old. And when we met him, the one thing that was absolutely clear in his mind is that he was allergic to debt. Whatever was going to be done here, it was going to be done on the basis of avoiding substantial debt. And every step of the way as Seaside was designed, the technology, the ideas that were eventually implemented had to do because they cost less. And I think that's, in retrospect, that's the huge story. Do you see this so-called amphitheater? This amphitheater is actually the retention pond for all of Seaside. So it has a double use, you know. In conventional development, you do a retention pond, you know, for the 1,000-year storm event. You put in chain link fence. It's a maintenance problem. Looks like hell. Waste space. Here, the avenues all come in like that. It can all sheet flow on the surface to this, and if there is a 1,000-year storm, it actually goes here. But in the meantime, it's actually used by little kids. This and the school playing field, oh, and just in front of the church for the wedding photographs, these are the only places where there's lawn. Lawn is illegal elsewhere because it requires maintenance and it requires water. Everything else is whatever grows. Basically, all of this is, these are all temporary buildings. They're for incubator retail. People get a chance to start their shops in very inexpensive places. If they do well, they get decanted to the 4-story mixed-use buildings where the rent is serious. And if they fail, they fail. But there's no air conditioning. You know, there's no insulation. There are no footings, no inspections. Why? It's temporary. Leave us alone. So it's the way to start things. And if you look at the early photographs of any place, from New York to Berkeley, this is pretty much how the merchants began. Very simple, temporary buildings that later on became Nordstrom's and Macy's and, you know, the big merchants. I think I remember that this building, which again is temporary and just sitting on the ground, sitting on sleds on the ground. is where the bookstore was incubated, Sundog Books, which is a terrific operation. And, you know, bookstores don't necessarily survive. So they proved themselves here, and then they went, and once they could actually pay a real lease, they moved over, and they're now over there in the two-story building using both stories and becoming a real business, you know, and employing, you know, half a dozen or more people. And that's one of the great stories. And incidentally, for every successful store, there's been one or two failures. I mean, it's work. It isn't just saying, follow these rules and you'll end up like Seaside. It's work to do it. These shops are where the places finally go. Pizitz, which is a nice little department store, is a direct outgrowth of the original tables, Daryl Davis's original open-air tables. That's where she decanted her operation. Okay, look, these are the new incubators. The newest of the incubators are the Airstreams. That's a mixed-use building, shops, offices, and 2 stories of apartments. You know, that's a mixed-use building, which is, by the way, very nice, but that's a very expensive way to build. All the 4-story buildings are expensive, no way around it. And if you're going to wait till you have the money to build them, you won't. You have to build the single story and then higher. And by the way, our other projects here on the coast are always that way. We always begin with single story, and then they move on to higher later. Now, these are the live-work units, okay, which are not the same as mixed use. Mixed use is, you know, they're different people. It's not the same people that own the apartments don't own the stores. These are owned as single entities. Like, that's an apartment, I mean, that's a dwelling, and that's a shop. That's a dwelling, and that's a shop. There are 22 of them, and they sold immediately. And every time we design a community, the developers fight us in the live-work units. And then they come back and say, oh, they sold the best and for the highest price. And the reason is that there's you know, everybody thinks, developers think that the only American dream is the little house in the prairie, you know, which is has been reduced to the single-family lot in the cul-de-sac. But there's another dream, which is being your own boss. A lot of people came to America to be their own boss, and the live-work unit allows you to dream of being your own boss, in fact, often to implement. You know, the little store you always wanted to run, the little cafe, the restaurant, you can do it. The good thing for the master developer is that a lot of retail gets built without risk to the developer. That's on somebody else's, it's on somebody else's checkbook and on somebody else's watch to do it. But all these are live-work units. The new urbanism is, despite what people think, is agnostic to style. Okay, we're not style conscious. Like, for example, if you look at that, you see 2 postmodernist houses and a completely modernist one over there. Or actually, even more telling, over here, you see a whole row of relatively traditional townhouses and then a totally modernist one. Okay, we don't code, and this is all, they didn't get variances. That's how the code works here. So this is the chapel. All we did was reserve the site for a chapel. The citizens themselves raised the money to do it, which is actually the old way of doing things. This is a good shot. Here are 3 towers. People think, oh, they're so romantic. Oh, isn't it nice, towers? Those are not aesthetic. That gives every house a chance of a water view. And it's one of the ways that you increase value of the real estate deep, deep into the, you know, into the hinterland, which had no value. So there's several techniques you use. The first one is you have the streets all end on the beach, no ambiguity. And then you have a pavilion that signals to the whole depth visually. That pavilion at the end of every street says, here's access to the beach and it's yours. you can actually see it. Aha, there's the beach. But the third way is that every house is allowed to have a tower of limited footprint so that they don't block each other's view. And the view from up there is really beautiful. And that's one of the reasons that people have paid well above waterfront prices to live at a quarter mile from the waterfront. You know, one of the things when you make really narrow roads is the pedestrian becomes absolutely dominant. Here, 5-year-old children, because the speed is so low, 5-year-old children, it's perfectly safe. So what it's done is really liberate the kids. That's actually it. They'll have to move very slowly. Well, you know, that was the first house. That's where Robert lived. You can see that it has overhangs and it has the metal roof that actually reflects the sunlight, which, by the way, is now very common. At that time, it was never used in any respectable house. In fact, we got into trouble by having such low-end materials as zinc roof, which is now absolutely conventional. So the overhangs, the porch, the ventilation at the top, but also the native species. And I remember my brother Douglas crawling actually and looking at these things that were really very low and ugly and picking up samples and saying, look, this is really excellent. This is what it is. We have to keep it. So most of what you see in a place like that actually is underbrush that looked awful, and everybody else just bushwhacks, gets rid of. And by building the houses, blocking the wind, the sea wind, they've grown and become oaks. And there's no maintenance required. And all of this was due to it being less expensive. Now the brick is another example. Of course the brick per square foot is more expensive than asphalt, but you can order it up in very small increments because it's hand installed. You know, the asphalt guys, they don't get out of bed, you know, for less than a quarter mile or half a mile of pavement. So while it costs less, it costs more to put it in and have to carry it for years. Well, these guys, I remember they would come in and they would just do 3 lots at a time. And another thing is, because we tried to save money, the roads were narrow, which means we didn't pay very much. And then this actually remained to filter the water down. So originally, I mean, there was actually no notion of pervious surface in those days. Nothing. It was all about putting it in the pipe. You know, you take the storm water, you put it in the pipe. Of course, that was too expensive. So we did this, which proved to be absolutely sound environmentally, but not for that reason. We did this because it was less expensive. And I think one of the things that's going to happen that's tragic about the current environmental practice is that everything costs more. You know, the high-tech solution to everything, the high-tech pervious surface, the high-tech LEED standards for housing, all that stuff basically works against the success of environmentalism because it costs 30% more. And there's no reason for that. If you do it the original way, you know, the original green, it costs less. And not only is it less expensive, it's actually the more logical way to do it. It's more handcrafted. Anyway, so inadvertently, Seaside, and not because we had this in mind, but inadvertently, this has become an excellent model. And this might, in the end, be the most important of all the ways that you can interpret Seaside, is what it shows in terms of an environmental solution that is actually simple, affordable, and doesn't require a great deal of training or skill. All these people who laid out Sacramento and San Diego and Kansas City and Chicago and so forth had a conception way beyond, you know, whatever they were confronting when they designed it. And that is exactly what has disappeared from American development practice, which is why they can only think of a subdivision or a shopping center or an office park. They can never think in terms of a town. And that is the mortal problem. That's why everything is coming out so badly. You know, there is no vision. Vision has this kind of funny smell, very romantic. Vision is just simply looking past the present. The discipline of vision is not being sort of sunk by present circumstance, reduced to the present circumstances, which often are nothing. As I said, in 1980, nothing was possible here, nothing except a bunch of townhouses. But we could look 30 years out and conceive it. And so it was conceived as a town.
Additional funding for American Makeover is provided by the Fund for the Environment and Urban Life and the Congress for the New Urbanism.